This is Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, and we are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, and guess who's back? My co-host, my erstwhile co-host. I just like using that word erstwhile. David Feldman. Hello, David.
It's good to be back.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. The new Capitol Citizen's out. More details at the end of the show.
Yes, we'll have more about how you can get the Capitol Hill Citizen at the end of the show. As for today's program, when politicians talk about being business-friendly, what they really mean is management-friendly. They make sure the CEOs and upper management are making their money regardless of whether or not they're building a robust business or whether or not their business is building a robust community. Henry Ford, no flaming socialist, had the savvy to know that he needed to pay his workers a living wage so that they had enough money to buy his cars. And when a business shares its profits with its workforce, not only does the business continue to thrive, but it benefits the whole society. Politicians try to woo us with the promises of a management-friendly environment as if that will improve all of our lives. History tells us that's not true. Strong unions and a living wage will improve all of our lives. Our first guest, Kshama Sawant, won a seat in Seattle City Council with that platform. Today, she's at the helm of the group Workers Strike Back. We'll speak to her about that organization, the state of the labor movement, the definition of socialism, and how we can turn Labor Day into a major workers' action day. That's in the first half of the program. In the second half of the program, in the age of COVID, how important is it to go to the office? Some studies have shown that remote work is actually more efficient and productive than a schlep to the office. It can relieve both workers and organizations of the burdens associated with commuting to a physical, expensive workplace. Even the process of reassessing what makes an effective workplace can reform tired old systems that are only in effect by default. Inertia is a hell of a drug. At the same time, there are many reported benefits to working face-to-face. Office culture thrives on spontaneous interactions that can't happen over Zoom. And overlapping workplace and living space can blur the lines between work life and home life. Our second guest today will be Washington Post columnist and associate editor Marc Fisher to discuss his reporting on the return to office issue among government employees. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's speak to one of the most successful socialist politicians in our lifetime. David?
Kshama Sawant is a teacher, activist, organizer, socialist, and she served on Seattle City Council from 2014 to 2023. She defeated a 16-year incumbent Democrat to become the first socialist elected in a major U.S. city in decades. Ms. Sawant has taught at Seattle Central Community College, Seattle University, and the University of Washington, Tacoma. And she has been an activist in her union, which is the American Federation of Teachers Local 1789. She's been fighting against budget cuts and tuition hikes, and she helped organize demonstrations for marriage equality. She participated in the movement to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and was a visible presence in the Occupy movement. She is also the host of Workers Strike Back's news and analysis broadcast, On Strike. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Kshama Sawant.
Thank you so much.
Welcome indeed, Kshama Sawant. I
Sure.
want to start by getting your reaction to a historical figure in our country, Eugene Debs, who I'm sure you're quite familiar with. In the late 19th and early 20th century, he was a lead champion of American workers, especially railroad workers. He was arrested. He was imprisoned by the Wilson administration's Justice Department for speaking out against World War I. And while he was in prison, he ran for president and got 1 million votes, which today would be the equivalent of over 3 million votes. Late in his career, in the 1920s, a reporter approached him and said, "Mr. Debs, you've been fighting all your life for working people. What is your greatest regret?" And Debs said, paraphrasing, "The American people under our Constitution can have almost anything they want, but it doesn't seem like they want much of anything at all. That was the judgment of someone who devoted his entire life to try to organize workers. But you know what he meant when he said they don't seem to want much of anything at all. He meant they didn't want it enough to mobilize, to organize, to put pressure on the lawmakers. That's what he meant, not that if you took a public opinion poll, they didn't want that. They didn't exert the energy. And that's what disappointed him so much near the end of his life. You think that's still the case?
No, and I mean, definitely not the case today. That much is profoundly clear, and I don't think it is helpful for us to be ambiguous about that. In fact, it should be extremely energizing for anybody on the left who aims to provide leadership in the labor leadership and so on, that we actually have historic shift going on in American working class consciousness, where there is a willingness to fight back, a real hunger for strategy. I would say that what's overwhelmingly clear to me as somebody who's been a socialist, a Marxist, and an activist for well over a decade, that what working people are parched for is real leadership that can actually garner the kind of victories that ordinary people are looking for. You know, whether you talk about a $25 an hour minimum wage, or good union jobs, or Medicare for all. If you look at the polls, people are desirous of all those things. And as I said, if you look at the strike action, last year, 2023, was an unprecedented year because it had more, last year had more American workers go out on major strike actions since all the way back to 1986. And what I mean by major strike action is strike actions that involved at least 1,000 workers. So this was a historic year. We saw also the UAW strike action. But just very quickly, also on Eugene Debs, Ralph, I mean, I don't know what his state of mind might have been towards the end of his life, but I can certainly tell you what he himself learned during his life as a socialist. He was initially, I think, maybe he thought that working class people wouldn't be able to fight. He was initially skeptical of the effectiveness of strike actions as well. And in fact, he himself learned massively important lessons, for example, from the 1894 Pullman strike in Chicago, where workers carried out a wildcat strike against the recommendation of the American Railway Union. And Debs was actually sent to talk the workers down from the strike. But then he himself, he was able to witness what were then called the company town conditions, just the horrendous conditions facing Pullman workers and the brutality that they were facing from the bosses. And he changed his tune, and he instead led the union into backing the strike and helped organize a major boycott of Pullman cars with over 100,000 workers walking off the jobs. So I think he himself evolved in a dramatic way by observing what American workers, who were themselves subjected to miserable conditions, were nonetheless willing to rise to the occasion and fight back courageously.
Let's go to the Seattle City Council. When you were elected, you said clearly that you were elected as a socialist and you had an agenda. And Seattle was in the middle of some pretty powerful companies. Microsoft, for example, Boeing, for example, Amazon, for example. So you were surrounded by very powerful corporate capitalist companies. And yet, by the sheer advancement of the facts, communicating with workers, and your relentlessness, tell us what you accomplished.
As you correctly said, Ralph, from day one, we had all these major corporations arrayed against us. Additionally, we had the corporate landlord lobby against us, the entire real estate industry, the restaurant industry. All of these businesses were deeply hostile to everything that my office, Socialist Council office, stood for in Seattle. And in fact, the very first campaign that we were able to win, which David mentioned, where we unseated a 16-year powerful incumbent of the city council who had actually voted against paid sick leave for workers. So that was in 2013 when we won the election. We won the election precisely because we made the election campaign itself as a vehicle for the movement for a $15 an hour minimum wage in Seattle. So that was the same year that workers and the labor movement were fighting for $15 an hour, and many other workers' rights in SeaTac, which is a neighboring city of Seattle. And that year in 2013, we won our election as a socialist to city council, and that effort in CTAC also won. So we made this sort of a joint effort that, workers won $15 an hour in CTAC in this small city. We're bringing the movement for $15 an hour to Seattle. And we proclaimed correctly that the fact that we had won our election that year, despite all the odds being against us, was a referendum. The race that I ran in was a referendum on $15 an hour because we made it so. We put $15 an hour as a demand on the map of Seattle politics. And so just weeks after I took office in 2014, I helped launch the 15 Now grassroots movement. And this 15 Now movement played the historic pivotal role alongside our council office to win the $15 an hour minimum wage, which was over 66% jump in Seattle's wages. This minimum wage increase lifted 100,000 workers out of poverty. And in fact, because we were able to win and we had to fight hard to win this, we won cost of living adjustment with the minimum wage. So today, Seattle's minimum wage is nearly $20 an hour, which is the highest in any major city in the United States. All of this took a fight back against virtually every corporate entity which was fighting tooth and nail against us. And I use the word fight not accidentally or as some sort of rhetorical flourish. It is actually a fight. This is class war. We are in the system of capitalism where a few multimillionaires and billionaires gain untold riches at the expense of the vast majority of the working class. So capitalism, its status quo is class war against the working class, against working people. And so for working people to win anything, even a small measure of justice like an increase in the minimum wage, requires an all-out fight back. That is what we conducted. And we did that, as you said, of course, by communicating with people, but also by organizing. This was a very important thing. We used our office as an organizing office. We organized working people. We mobilized thousands into the struggle. And on that basis, we also won the Amazon tax, and we won a whole range of a renter's bill of rights.
Now, why don't you just briefly list what you won regarding tenants, the tax on Amazon, and whether the unions in Washington State supported you enthusiastically? Let's go through those briefly if you can.
Yes, we won the Amazon tax in 2020 in the midst of the George Floyd rebellion and the Black Lives Matter movement, with tens of thousands of the rank and file activists of the protests, including many, many Black working people who were there for the Black Lives Matter rallies, strongly supported our Amazon tax demand, and we won a tax of over $214 million to be raised every year by taxing the wealthiest individuals in the city, the wealthiest corporations like Amazon. And that money is raised every year to fund affordable housing, meaning publicly owned social housing and social services for the people who are the most vulnerable. In addition to that, we won, as I said, a whole range of renters' rights. One of the rights we won is a moratorium on evictions of people during the coldest and rainiest winter months. Another is a moratorium on evictions of children and public school workers during the school year. We also won a 6 month notice for any significant rent increase. We also won a very strong law which says that if a landlord ends up displacing a tenant because of an inordinate rent increase, anything greater than 10%, then that landlord owes that tenant 3 months worth of rent. So we won laws of this kind. We also won full fund through the People's Budget campaigns that we conducted every year. We also won tens of millions of dollars additional outside of the Amazon tax for affordable housing and for social services, including for our homeless community members. And we also won full funding for any renter who is facing eviction charges to have a city funded public defense in court. So these are all significant victories. I still, even today, Ralph, when I'm out on the streets in Seattle, when I'm in the grocery stores, working people come up to me and talk about how many of these individual laws that we won made a huge difference in their lives, allowed them to remain housed, allowed them to quit their second job because of the minimum wage increase, allowed them to get affordable homes because of the Amazon tax. So these are having real impacts. And as far as the labor movement is concerned, undoubtedly union members, rank and file union members, played a crucial, a central role in winning all of these victories. And many left progressive labor leaders also played a role. It's also true that we needed the rank and file of the labor movement to push the labor leadership into many sections of the labor leadership into supporting us. And I think a lot of this resistance from the labor leadership has to do with the fact that they are intimately tied to the Democratic Party establishment, and that includes in the city of Seattle, and that makes them really hesitant to support this kind of rank and file led militancy that we were organizing. And at the same time, it's also a prevalence of business unionism, which has been really deadly for the labor movement, has had deadly consequences, because business unionism is this idea that the role of the labor leader is to negotiate, to make peace between the bosses and the workers. It's completely wrong. It's exactly the opposite. The role of labor leadership is to organize a fight by mobilizing rank and file members against the bosses, with the understanding that the interests of the bosses, the greed of the bosses, is diametrically opposed to the needs of workers.
Now, before we go to your definition of socialism, what you achieved, Kshama, was called in Western Europe years ago social democratic policies. And what you were trying to achieve, and they blocked you in the Seattle City Council, were measures that would have been considered progressive New Deal measures. So, what do you mean when you say socialism? How do you define it in the context of all the work you've done the last 10 years?
Socialism is a fundamentally different society than capitalism. In other words, in order to establish socialism, it would require the overthrowing of the current global capitalist system. And that's not a small thing, but that is what will be needed actually if we are going to bring about genuine high standards of living for working people and not the hoarding of trillions of dollars by the billionaire class. It will require for us to overthrow capitalism and establish global socialism in order to even begin addressing the climate catastrophe that is the most overarching existential threat against humanity and against the planet. So, in other words, socialism is a fundamentally different kind of society and economy than capitalism. It means society where the economy is democratically controlled and run by the vast majority of working people. In other words, billions of working people having actual democratic control over the economy and democratically deciding how the economy should be run, how the resources, the vast amounts of natural and other resources and technology should be used for the betterment of humanity.
Excuse me for interrupting. Let's be specific here. Would you, A, favor worker-owned industry and commerce, number one? And second, would you favor nationalizing the big banks and nationalizing the huge military production companies that do 95% of their business with the U.S. government anyway? Take those two.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I was actually coming to that because in order to achieve even the beginnings of what I call a socialist society, it will actually have to start with working people, millions, billions of working people fighting for publicly owned industry. In other words, taking the commanding heights of the economy into democratic control by workers. That will actually involve a revolutionary movement against the bosses, against the billionaire class. So, absolutely, I support worker owned industry, but we have to be clear that is not a thing that can happen and under capitalism or can happily coexist with capitalism. That's not such a thing. In order to actually have workers control, we have to overthrow capitalism itself. It cannot happen in the context of capitalism because capitalism implies, by definition, the control of the economy, of its resources by a handful of multi-billionaires. So you can't have a worker-owned economy coexisting with billionaire-owned economy. Those two things are mutually exclusive. So in other words, we're fighting for a world free of billionaires. Talking about when you say nationalizing industry, absolutely agree. In fact, that, as I said, that is the first step that needs to happen. But rather than calling it nationalizing, I would call it taking the industries into public ownership. And as far as banks and military are concerned, absolutely. I would also include fossil fuel. But just to clarify for your listeners, we're not talking about taking the fossil fuel industry and the big banks of Wall Street, for example, into public ownership and then continuing exploitation. That makes no sense. What we're talking about is taking these industries into public ownership in order for those industries to work in the interests of the working class, in the interests of the planet. So, in other words, taking the fossil fuel industries and the big banks that financially underwrite the fossil fuel industry into democratic public ownership means putting a stop to fossil fuel usage and retooling the entire industry with a just transition for the workers who are in the fossil fuel industry today into providing clean energy resources, massively expanding public transportation, building a high speed rail corridor, electrified industry, electrifying buildings, that sort of thing.
When you say capitalism, do you distinguish between giant corporate capitalism, which dominates the world, and small business, like an owner of a restaurant or delicatessen on Main Street, USA? Do you think that's exploitive at that level, family owned business?
We absolutely, as a socialist, I would make a distinction between massive corporations and small businesses. As a matter of fact, small businesses, as other socialists have noted before me, are actually, and I'm talking about actual small businesses, the businesses that are struggling for survival every single day, the businesses that ended up taking on the brunt alongside working people, taking on the brunt of the pandemic and the recession. And in fact, every recession, most of these small businesses are actually as much at the mercy of the capitalist class and big corporations as are working people. And that's why I said very clearly that when I talk about socialism, I'm talking about the big corporations, as I said, in other words, the commanding heights of the economy to be brought into democratic public ownership. I think in that kind of space, small businesses would probably still exist. I would say, though, that no business has the right to exploit any workers. So I think socialism would need for workers to have the automatic right to a union, even in small business. And I'll also say that actually there are small business owners in Seattle, and some of them identify as socialists, who helped us fight for the $15 an hour minimum wage, who helped us win the Amazon tax, and made a clear distinction that this tax is not on the smallest businesses of the city. This tax is actually on the top 1%, 2% of the wealthiest corporations in our city. But like I said, no business should have the right to mistreat their workers.
And all the millions of franchisees like McDonald's and Burger King who are controlled by these corporations with all their fine print contracts, they're very much exploited as well. We're talking with Kshama Sawant, who is leading and working with workers on a group called Workers Strike Back, which we'll hear about in a few minutes. But I want to ask you some quick questions for quick answers that are on our people's mind. And that is, what do you think of Bernie Sanders, the socialist senator from Vermont, and someone who you've known for a long time?
Bernie Sanders ran historic campaigns in 2016 and 2020 calling for a political revolution against the billionaire class with a campaign program that was hugely popular. It was a working class campaign program that the Democratic Party establishment had no time for, and they made sure to put the kibosh on both of his campaigns. And so Bernie Sanders is a cautionary tale in the sense that he is, I believe, a genuinely intentioned person. But it's what happens when you are trying to keep the peace with the capitalist party. You end up being forced to surrender to the pressures, and that's what's happened. And so, if you want to win universal health care or Medicare for all, I believe he's genuine in wanting it, and that he was genuine in his two campaigns in the Democratic primaries. But if we as working people want to win Medicare for all, we will need mass action organized independent of the Democrats and Republicans.
Tell us about Workers Strike Back, and first give the website for it so people can get more information.
People can go to Workers Strike Back, all one word, workersstrikeback.org to get more information. Also, if you want to join, Workers Strike Back is a nationwide organization that I helped co-found alongside other socialists, union members, working people and community members. Workers Strike Back is a nationwide organization. We are together organizing to win a $25 an hour minimum wage, quality affordable housing and free healthcare for all, good union jobs for all. We're also organizing against every kind of discrimination and oppression. And we are also calling for a new party for working people.
You know, we've been trying on this program to highlight the opportunity to use Labor Day as it was originally intended instead of just a commercial sales day and a day off. And we've been in touch with top leaders of the AFL-CIO and other unions, Postal Workers Union, Flight Attendants Union, the Farmers Worker Union, the Transportation Union, and they were all very supportive of having thousands of events at the local level around a agenda for American labor, not just living wage and universal health care, but changing the obstruction of labor laws against union organizing, the issue of private pension exploitation by corporations, and so on. And although they all said that was a good idea to have all these events and invite candidates to take a stand and work with citizen groups in the area, they haven't announced any major effort and they haven't allocated any major resources. Do you have any connection with these labor leaders, starting with Liz Shuler, the first woman to run the AFL-CIO in Washington, D.C., that has member unions with 13 million workers unionized?
I don't have personal contact with Liz Schuler, but the question that you're asking is very important because just to add to what you were saying, another example of what approach the vast sections of the labor leadership have taken is that they, in an unprecedented move, the majority of unions have actually passed, and this includes the AFL-CIO with Liz Schuler at the leadership as well, have passed resolutions calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. This is historic. Such a thing has never happened in relation to the US imperialism's policy towards the Israeli state. And in fact, even beyond that, recently, as you know, 7 unions representing 6 million workers passed a unified resolution publicly calling for an end to US military funding to the Israeli state. And that includes the Postal Workers Union, for example, the one that you mentioned, and many other powerful unions like the UAW, like the National Education Association, and so on. But every single one of these 7 unions rushed to already endorsed Biden and rushed to endorse Harris. And I use this example because the question of the genocidal war is paramount for our day and for the presidential election question. And here you see the leadership of the union movement calling for a ceasefire, and yet endorsing without any democratic discussion or vote by their rank and file members, immediately calling for a vote for the warmongers in chief, namely Biden and Harris. So this kind of disconnect shows you that a lot of the labor leadership, they are forced to speak about the things that matter to ordinary people, working class people, their own union members. But at the end of the day, they are tied at the hip to the Democratic Party, and they are also compromised by what I called earlier, which was business unionism, meaning they're all constantly trying to make some sort of peace with the bosses. This kind of approach where you're tied to the party of the bosses, which the Democratic Party is just as much as the Republican Party, you can't represent workers in any adequate way. So you see this disconnect between their rhetoric and their action.
I'm sure you'll agree that their recent unprecedented condemnation of the Israeli terror genocide in Gaza, with hundreds of thousands of fatalities already, including awful injuries and spreading diseases related to the bombardment day after day, came from the rank and file. Certainly, workers in the UAW and others began demanding that their leaders stop buying Israeli bonds and stop sitting on the sidelines and stop building these weapons of mass destruction for illegal empire purposes and turn their policy around. Don't you think this was a bottom-up pressure?
Yes, absolutely. It absolutely was. It absolutely was. These resolutions were passed by the leadership absolutely under pressure from the rank and file and from, from society as a whole, from working class people as a whole. I mean, because the starting point of all this was this historic phenomenon where a majority of American working class people opposed the war on Gaza, and a plurality of people supporting an end to US arms funding to Israel. It was under pressure from the working class as a whole and from the rank and file of the union movement that the labor leadership pushed forward the ceasefire. And that's why you can see that a lot of the labor leadership that is tied so closely to the Democratic Party elite, they will pass these resolutions or take these steps that they are forced to take because of the strong mood among the rank and file. But whatever they are not forced to do, they won't do.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We've been talking with Kshama Sawant, who is part of the movement called Workers Strike Back. You can go to workerstrikeback.org for more information. If you want to support the group, connect with some of the events they're holding around the country, you're free to do so. Thank you very much, Sama.
Thank you so much. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.
We've been speaking with Kshama Sawant. We will link to Workers Strike Back at ralphnaderradiohour.com. To go to the office or not to go to the office? That's the question we'll be asking Washington reporter Marc Fisher. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, August 16, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Consuming a drink with erythritol, an artificial sweetener used to add bulk to stevia and monk fruit and to sweeten low-carb keto products, more than doubled the risk of blood clotting in 10 healthy people, according to a recent report. That's according to a report from CNN. Clots can break off blood vessels and travel to the heart, triggering a heart attack, or to the brain, triggering a stroke. Previous research has linked erythritol to a higher risk of stroke, heart attack, and death. The study's author, Dr. Stanley Hazen, is the director of the Center for Cardiovascular Diagnostics and Prevention at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner Research Institute. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. More people than ever before are working remotely instead of going into the office. Is that a good thing? A bad thing? Neither? David?
Marc Fisher is an associate editor of the Washington Post, where he writes a column on Washington, the city, its suburbs, and the people, and issues of big city America. For 37 years, Mr. Fisher worked as a reporter and editor across various news sections at the Post, most recently focusing on Donald Trump and major breaking news events. He previously created and led the Metro staff's Enterprise Reporting Group, spent a decade as local columnist and blogger, served as the paper's special reports editor, wrote about politics and culture for the Style section, worked as Central Europe bureau chief on the Post's foreign staff, and covered D.C. schools and D.C. politics for the Metro section. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Marc Fisher.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you.
Welcome indeed, Marc. Today, we want to talk about an article that you wrote on June 22nd, 2024 in the Washington Post. It was an opinion piece, and you had the headline, Federal Workers Are Going Back to the Office, in a year now. And you quote in the article that Joe Biden promised in his 2022 State of the Union address that, quote, in Biden's words, the vast majority of federal workers will once again work in person, end quote. And you found in your reporting that was not true, and working by remote is more than just a statistical factoid. It represents a major disruption of interpersonal exchanges when people go to work in person. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the workplace has changed, and particularly office work. Most people who work with their hands are carrying on as they always did. But since COVID, we've seen that offices have emptied out in downtowns across the country. And Washington is particularly hard hit because 15-20% of the workers work for the federal or city governments. So there's been this emptying, this sort of sucking sound out of downtown Washington, which has had an enormous impact on the economy. So this is a multi-level issue and problem. And yet for many, if not most workers, they don't see it as a problem. They see it as a benefit. So people who had to be home during COVID have, by and large, especially in the government, stayed home. And it's one of those issues that it's interesting that neither party has made much of. And you would think one of them would pick up on this because a lot of taxpayers would not be too happy to learn that the great majority of the people that are working for them in the government are not in the office, not there to serve them. Now, the government, both the DC government and the federal government, have repeatedly promised that they're going to bring people back to the office, bring people back to work. And it just hasn't happened. And the surveys that I've looked at show that the great majority of those workers want to stay home, believe they can do just as good a job from home. But interestingly, when I ran this by some of the union leaders, they said, sure, a lot of people prefer to work at home and there ought to be that kind of flexibility, but it can't be all or nothing. It can't be even majority at home because you're losing out on the interpersonal contacts, the training of young new people in the office, the passing of kind of inner knowledge about the agency and how it operates down from one group to the next. And probably above all, the sense of collaboration and creativity that comes from just happenstance, serendipity, just hearing someone say something, oh, I know something about that. We can do some better work that way. Those kinds of interactions don't happen in a planned Zoom conversation. So it's a real dilemma. The unions are saying they would love to see more of their workers back in the office, but of course they don't want it sort of commanded from on high as an edict. So, and a lot of the bosses, both in private sector and in the public sector, have been scared off addressing this issue because they know their workers enjoy being at home and they don't want that confrontation. So we are really stuck on the horns of dilemma. It is a problem that no one wants to address.
Well, what is the people who work on productivity in white collar jobs saying about this? Because there's no doubt when you work at home, there are distractions. Sometimes there are members of the family who want your attention. You have the refrigerator nearby. You want to take a little snooze. Somebody knocks on your door to sell you something. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has measurements for office productivity. And tell us what studies have been completed on this. And by the way, if people are worried about employer surveillance, they now have an ability to place workers who work at home under minute surveillance. Can you discuss these issues?
Sure. Obviously, there's enormous disagreement from each side about to what extent one can be totally productive, as productive at home as at the office. And each side has its set of studies that they point to. There have not been really enormously comprehensive studies done across the country over time, comparing now versus pre-COVID. There have been a few smaller scale studies. There have been some efforts to measure productivity in certain government agencies versus those agencies that stayed in the office. For example, the Defense Department stayed in person almost entirely throughout the COVID period and since then. And so it's really inconclusive. I've looked at these studies. Some of the people at the unions and in Office of Management and Budget have looked at these studies, and everyone seems to agree that there's no conclusive proof one way or the other. There are people who clearly are more productive at home. They avoid the distractions at work. They avoid the hours of commuting. And then there are obviously people who come into the office. In fact, many people tell pollsters that they go into the office expressly to get away from those distractions at home that you were talking about, especially people with young children who need to get some quiet and some solid working time, and they'll go into the office for that reason. So, both anecdotally and according to the studies, it's all over the place. And I think everything is still in a state of flux. In portions of the private sector, law firms, for example, they're pulling people back into the office at least 3 or 4 days a week in many cases. Similarly, some government agencies have tried to do the same, but the compliance rate is not strong. A lot of people who are ordered back, the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, said back in January that all city workers have to come back to the office 4 days a week. Well, it hasn't happened. Some people come, some people don't, some people come part of the time. I wrote a column that appeared today in the Post about a woman who was working full time at Freddie Mac in the mortgage industry, full time as well for the DC government as deputy director of the Department of Building. She held down two full time jobs in the same hours because one job required her to come in person Mondays and Fridays, and the other Tuesdays through Thursdays. And she never told either of those employers that she was employed by the other one. So how much of that kind of double dipping is going on? Hard to say. We hear anecdotally about some cases here and there. So this has opened the door to a level of fraud and con games that nobody would want, certainly not taxpayers, certainly not employers. But it's also opened the door for people to be at home and take care of personal business and perhaps get more work done. So it is a mixed bag, but I think the long-term impact here is what we need to be studying and what I hope researchers will take a look at going forward. And that is this making folks more productive? Is it allowing the government to say that tax dollars are being spent wisely?
Well, this affects private business and industry, of course. And in recent months, I've been reading accounts that large employers of banks, for example, insurance companies, they really want their workers to come to work in person. They are more and more antagonistic to having their workers work remotely. Have you seen that kind of trend? They seem to be based on studies of productivity, communication, efficiencies, eye to eye contact, and a greater ability to have human interactions that lead to new ideas or new levels of enthusiasm.
That's absolutely right. And a number of industries have been pushing in that direction, and they've taken different approaches. There are some that have done this by edict and said, you come in 4 or 5 days a week, whatever it is, or else you lose your job. That has worked in some places, not so much in others. What's happened again and again is that workers have more power in this economy, this post-COVID economy, and there are places that have embraced remote work. And so workers are saying, I'm not doing it. Let me come in the minimal amount or stay home and do most of my work at home, or else I'm going elsewhere. And they are voting with their feet. So a lot of employers see that happening, see that they lose good talent or they don't get the good talent in the first place. If you look at the help wanted ads on the various job boards, you'll see that a lot of employers are now advertising jobs as being essentially remote. And that is proving to be a real drawing card. So there are companies that have tried to push people. There are companies that have tried to incentivize people to come in, whether that be through free food or meetings with the bosses or personal attention. It's shocking to me how few industries have tried those incentives because we have a real generational divide in this country. Older folks tend to be the ones who want to be in the office because they know the benefit they get from being with their workmates. They know the creative and personal satisfaction that comes from that. Whereas a lot of people who are younger, who perhaps started their work careers after the pandemic hit, they've never had that benefit. They don't see any upside to coming into the office. And so they consider it a tremendous imposition and they will vote with their feet to find other employment if they are required to come in.
Well, there are other findings recently. We're talking with Marc Fisher of the Washington Post. There are other findings, Marc, where recently you're more likely to get promoted as a young worker if you're working in the office than if you're working at home.
Absolutely. Out of sight, out of mind. That is just a basic aspect of human nature. We see what's immediately around us. In my field, for example, in a newsroom, something breaks and an editor needs to find a reporter to write a story. They look up from their desk and they see who's there. And they look around and see who's not busy. So you could say, well, you should take the extra step and survey the folks who are out there on the grid who are not in front of your eyes. But in a moment when you need something fast, you're going to go not only with the people who are there, but also with the people whose work you have seen in person. And I think that is the generational difference and the division that really needs to be healed in our work culture, where people who are in power, people who are employers, managers, they grew up in that in-person system and they have come to trust the people they know in person. And we all trust. Trust is built on repeated and enduring contact that we have with people. And that tends to be much stronger when it's in person. A lot of people in human resources complain that managers don't get to know their employees when it's an all remote situation. And there's less loyalty. People leave jobs and there's more turnover in companies that are all remote because they don't have that allegiance that comes from the intimacy of being in a work environment together.
Marc, there are always special situations where people need to work at home, family situations, for example, their own particular ailments, and nobody's disregarding that. That is not what we're talking about. There are also collateral effects empty restaurants and stores in areas with large office buildings, huge millions of square feet in cities in office buildings empty, a severe economic dislocation coming where these owners of these buildings can't pay their mortgages to the banks. Now, I know some people have said, look, the issue of remote work or working in the office shouldn't have to worry about whether there's enough business in restaurants or whether office buildings are empty or not. What do you think about the collateral effects here?
This is one of the most vexing issues in this whole nexus because a lot of workers quite reasonably make the point it's not my obligation as a worker to support the downtown of my city. And they argue that the economic benefits of working for small businesses are simply being displaced from downtowns to the suburbs or the outlying neighborhoods where people are now working from home. Well, somewhat. Downtowns are not just one more retail place. They are places that we all think of as the heart of our cities, indeed of the country. That's where we have sporting events. It's where we have arts events. It's where people gather for political and other gatherings. So downtowns play a vital role, or else the great majority of people around the world wouldn't choose to live in big cities. So the question is, how do we create a new kind of downtown that accounts for what's happened to our work culture? So those workers who say, I don't have an obligation to go downtown to the office just so that I can have lunch there, just so that some small business owner can maintain their restaurant. But a lot of mayors are saying, well, you kind of do. We all do.
Let's go to Steve.
Marc, I understand the idea of social isolation and the damage of that in general. But getting back to the workplace, we seem to be under this impression that COVID is over, although we've seen a surge in infections we haven't seen since the dawn of the vaccines. So with that in mind, and the fact that there are no conclusive studies about productivity, what's the problem here in the workplace that just won't work itself out?
Well, the problem is a mismatch between the desires of workers to be home, where they can work in their pajamas or hang out and with their kids in between work tasks or grab themselves a meal without going out. The conflict between that attitude and the desire of employers and governments to have people together for greater efficiency and for greater camaraderie and collaboration. That's a raw, essential, elemental conflict that has not been resolved. And so, because it breaks generationally, you have to look forward a decade or two to a point where most people have not had that work experience in the office, don't see what the benefit is, don't know what they're missing. And so it's hard to see us going back to anything like what we had before.
But you said it yourself. You said the editor looks around and sees who's not busy.
Precisely.
And so the guys at the office who's not busy, who might be more productive if he wasn't in the office. There seems to be a little bit of a contradiction there.
There is a contradiction. But most workers are not managers. Most workers are not bosses. And so the frustration among bosses can be quite high. They know that there are people out there who aren't really doing all the work they ought to be doing. And they know there are people who could benefit from learning from the folks who are in the office. On the other hand, from the worker's perspective, they again don't know what they're missing, and therefore they don't see any real reason to come into the office. It varies a lot from industry to industry, and obviously there are fields of work where this is just not an issue at all. Doctors are in their offices, teachers are in their classrooms, and so on. So we will always have a large number of people, perhaps half or more, slightly more of the workforce, who are going into their workplace because that's how their industry works. But for those who are in pure office work, there's not been the kind of consumer revolt. Ralph was talking about what happens when you go to a social security office or a DMV or any kind of office where you have in-person business to attend to, and there's hardly anyone there. More and more, we're seeing that in one industry after another, people are being shunted over to automated phone attendants which is a technology that I think we can all agree is not up to the job. And so there's this endless frustration that consumers have of dealing with machines on the phone rather than people behind a counter in person. And nonetheless, the frustration has not boiled over to the point where people say, give me the real person in person, or I'm moving my business elsewhere.
Anna?
My question is, why should we care about office culture as a society, as a workforce? Some people might say that office culture is a manipulation tactic to tell workers that the place they have to go to earn a wage is actually their family. That's where they get their friends. Don't go to your community to find your friends. Instead, we're coercing you to turn to people you work with and look at them as friends. And then it's leveraged so you don't go on strike or do something, it's oftentimes used as leverage against workers. And a lot of the material benefits that you're outlining really seem to be benefiting the bosses, not the workers. And what would you say to, please allow me to put away the world's tiniest violin for the poor bosses that don't get to walk around the office tricking people into doing more work than they actually consent to? And I guess to sum it up, there is commute versus community. We invested, decades of infrastructure in commuter culture where people don't really have the free time during the week to invest in their community. That hasn't always been the case. And there's an artificial community at the workplace. Why is that more important than, going back to an organic community where you live, work, or where you live and raise your families? Why can't you just work there?
That's a great question, and it's certainly an issue that nags at a lot of people. And I think we're starting to see, as mayors and city councils and activists around the country confront this issue, we're starting to see some movement toward the idea of subsidizing the development of live-work communities, especially in downtowns. So the idea would be that you don't have to separate your work culture versus the idea of having a community at home. If you live in the same neighborhood that you work in, you can combine it all or set it up the way you wish. And yet, I think, although there are certainly workers who look at office culture as domineering or kind of an imposition, I think there are at least as many, and the data tells us a lot more than that, who make their friends at work. They may make their friends among coworkers who join them in criticizing or disliking the bosses. But whatever the bonding element is, whether it be after work athletics or lunchtime gossip groups or just people paddling around on the newsroom floor, there are bonds and relationships that are formed at work because work is where we spend many, if not most, of our waking hours in the way we've set up our society. So given that that's the case, and given that whether you're working from home or in the office, you're going to be spending a big chunk of your time doing it, it makes sense to pitch the workplace as a place that is potentially a foundation of community. And that is the function that it has served, whether it be through unions or social groups, affinity groups these days. Some of these take place under the sponsorship of employers. Some of them take place in defiance of employers. But if you look at some of the survey data on how people make friends in our country, work is generally number one or number two on the list. And so if we posit that this new work culture is going to mean fewer such opportunities, that to me doesn't sound like a good recipe for avoiding the isolation, the atomization, and the anxieties that we see on the rise in our culture.
But isn't that last point, that seems to be kind of confusing chicken and egg. People reporting that most of their friendships come from the workplace is not the same as saying that they don't want friends from anywhere else. If you spend 8 hours a day at work and you spend, 2 to 3 hours a day commuting, an hour a day if you're lucky, a lot of the people you come into contact with would be workers. So I think I hear your points. I also want to point out in response that what the situation is, it's still an artificial, people are living within an artificially established dynamic. And so that might not mean that that's actually like the only alternative the only option for how they make their friends. It's just what's available
Well,
because
sure. That's absolutely
time and
right.
space.
But it's also true that the workplace is one of the rare places we have where people meet folks unlike themselves, especially as our society gets more and more self-segregated residentially. People are moving to places where people think like them, have same political persuasions, and as well as often the same race or ethnicity. And so the workplace is one place where you can kind of mix that up and give people an opportunity to be among, learn from, get to know people unlike themselves. We don't have too many of those places left in our country.
We've been talking with Marc Fisher of the Washington Post, a very versatile journalist. He does opinion pieces, he does straight reporting on what's happening, and he also is often the go-to person by the editor to synthesize a lot of inputs of a major story for page one of the Post. Thank you very much for your work, Marc, and I'm sure this subject is definitely not going to go away.
That's absolutely right. Thanks very much, Ralph, and everybody else. Appreciate it.
We've been speaking with Marc Fisher. We will link to his work at the Washington Post at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Kshama Sawant and Marc Fisher. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our program. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap-up. We got plenty of it, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard.
For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you. The brand new latest issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen is out. Some have called it a blockbuster issue, 40 pages, and a lot of color and pictures. And you want to get a copy, just go to capitalcitizen.com. And for a donation of $5 or more, you can get your copy sent right away, first class. If you want more copies, go to that website for instructions. Spread the word. Congress is a central institution that we must recover.
Listen to me, people. Do you understand we gotta stand up? Oh, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, step up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, you should. Step up. Step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up and